Welcome to the 3x5 news, views, and reviews scribble on index cards. Today, if Trump voters are the new normal, then what am I? A stranger in a strange land. Subhead number 2. The low information voter can still choose wisely. Subhead number 3. When voting, ignorance is not necessarily a deal breaker. I spent much of the past 8 years wondering why so many people support Trump. Why are they so different from me? Many people I know and the experts I follow, why are their value systems so upside down? How do they get flipped on their heads? How is it that Christians view compassion and care extended to anyone outside their circle as aiding and abetting the enemy, or even as sins for ostensibly putting those in their own world in harm's way? How do they justify supporting sinner extraordinaire Trump? I won't recite the man's litany of crimes and misdemeanors. Oh wait, there are no misdemeanors, only felonies. Of course, we really only need the main event. Inciting insurrection by spreading false claims about election fraud, and on January 6, encouraging supporters to march on the Capitol. He and his supporters basically reenacted the British invasion of Washington, D.C. in 1814 when they set fire to both the Capitol and the White House. Then Trump exponentially compounded the betrayal of everything America stands for by pardoning those who breached the Capitol and attacked police. On election eve, I remember those moments when state after state felt like dominoes for Trump. I know that Trump won the popular vote by only a slight margin, but coupled with the awareness that Harris voters were concentrated in areas such as cities with a high population density, that was not much consolation. Geographically, the length and breadth of America were Trump country. From sea to shining sea, America was Trump country. It seemed like complacency about Trump's wrongdoings had spread as if the nation had been dosed by the proverbial something in the water. I have had to face the Trump voters are the new normal. In other words, it's not Trump voters who are different, it's me, and people like me. Suddenly, instead of spending my days pondering why they are so different, I did an about face and began to wonder why we are different. Spoiler, the answer to that is much less difficult than trying to figure out why they are so different. I would like to begin by acknowledging that within the circle of people they care about, many Trump voters, women mostly, but a few men too, are lovely people, loving, compassionate, caring, dedicated to service, whereas someone like me, okay, me specifically, was, when young, selfish, kind of a brat, and sometimes a bully. Of course, at a certain point, I learned that it behooved me to treat people considerately, but I didn't actually know how to care about others. In other words, I was a typical young man. What turned me into a compassionate person who empathizes with all humanity? First, let me make clear that I'm not a saint, even if my wife and son might think so. Not. I don't extend the courtesy of compassion to the likes of Trump and Putin. In fact, growing up in the 1950s, I had every reason to keep tight the circle of people I cared about, just like Trump voters do now. To begin with, the Soviet Union, though admittedly in part because the U.S. inflated the Red Menace or Red Scare to justify building up its own military and nuclear arsenal, had become our mortal enemy. Thus disposed the United States, especially its young men, to remain on as much a martial footing as during World War II, which had ended just a few short years before. As children, most every summer day, we played army with our friends in a different war from the Revolutionary to World War II. Our preoccupation with war was not so subtly reinforced by those fabled duck and cover drills. Our school's version saw us retreating to the coat room, facing the wall and covering our heads with our hands. Though arguably, today's kids probably have it worse, with school shooter hide-and-place drills because the worst-case scenario not only actually happens, but fairly frequently. Anyway, the drills, coupled with the testing of air raids which signal nuclear attack, reinforced the feeling that we were under threat. The threat reached its most dangerous level during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most 12-year-olds might have been dimly aware of it at best, but if only subconsciously stressed by the nuclear age thus far. This time I was truly alarmed, and I looked to the sky for Russian bombers, not aware that an attack would come via missiles from Cuba. What made me further inclined to be conservative was that I was brought up Catholic. I really bought into it. Though I only went to 1 year of parochial school, as they called it then, I was an altar boy, now called a server, in the Latin Mass, and spent a lot of time afraid that I would go to hell. The religion preyed on my weaknesses, fear, and guilt. In other words, no part of me questioned authority. Growing up Catholic did instill in me a keen sense of ethics, even though it was forced. Unlike many atheists whose goodness is natural and organic, it helped lay the foundation for caring for others. Adding to that, while our family was upper middle class, I grew up listening to my late mother's stories about life during the Great Depression with her sister and single mother. Evictions, all the cliches, ketchup sandwiches, no dental care, being forced by her mother to appeal to the welfare office for help on behalf of her family. I wasn't morally developed enough that I felt compassion or empathy for the poor or the underserved or the disadvantaged, nor was my mother a liberal. But I owe my mother because, while it was hardly her intention, her stories of poverty instilled guilt in me for growing up so comfortably. It was synergistic with the whole Catholic guilt thing and later instrumental in my emerging political consciousness. After stumbling through a couple of years of college, I actually became working class or lower because I had acquired neither a degree nor skills. Also, I was genuinely averse to being part of the oppressor class, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return to discovering what the catalyst was that changed a rigid, rebellious kid who was down with military force into a bleeding heart liberal, or more accurately at the time, radical. Concurrent with me being a selfish conservative was an emerging interest in pop music. Being around 1961, my brother and I listened to New York AM pop radio. He, the always echoing WABC, Harry Harrison, and myself, WINS, then a music station, now infomercials. We all know what happened next. In 1963, the Beatles exploded. Never mind the emergence of color TV, suddenly our black and white worlds transformed into color. With the Beatles grounded in R&B and the Stones in blues, it wasn't long before we turned to black music, soul, R&B, blues, and even jazz, though I was still young. I was always predisposed to be sympathetic to black people because of my mother's stories about the poor, my enthrallment with black athletes in my teens, beginning with the likes of football player Jim Brown and culminating with Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the '68 Olympics. They were my heroes. And with some awareness of the work of Martin Luther King, now my hero, it became clear that both black music and white pop and rock stood in counterpoise for the prevailing culture or establishment. Soon, rock spearheaded a lifestyle. First, drugs and mind expansion, free sex, as they called it back then, civil rights, women's rights, the environment, and most important, opposition to the Vietnam War. Following it all in the then premier countercultural publication Rolling Stone and elsewhere, and soon participating to a certain extent. The development of my political consciousness was given a big boost by watching on TV the 1968 Democratic Chicago Convention, marked by police brutality. To sum up, music was the conduit to me later expanding my mind and becoming a progressive. Launching on that path did not require me to be officially educated in the issues of the day. My point is, and I will return to it in my conclusion, is that you can actually be a low information voter, as the euphemism for ignorant goes, but still be able to intuit who to vote for. The guideposts are simple: a basic sense of right and wrong, and who the cool people are backing. Sure, anti war candidates back then, such as Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern, were not exactly cool. Other than President Obama and AOC, almost no politicians are. But my presidential voting career has been bookended by arguably two of the most uncool candidates ever. As an 18-year-old, I watched Richard Nixon and thought, he is so weird. It didn't exactly require a sixth sense to see that. And now we have a president who epitomizes a Florida country club type who made, or attempted to make, his money building gilded buildings and gambling casinos. Or, as New Republic editor Michael Tomasky called Trump's Gaza plan, quote, deeply held Trumpian fantasy, hotels, casinos, golf courses, steakhouses, bathrooms with chandeliers, end quote. In other words, the exact opposite of cool, corny. Back in the 60s, That would have been at least as anathema to me, most people my age as Nixon. Trump is a latter day representation of the people that Hunter Thompson lampooned back then. What has changed today? Why aren't more and more people who listen to rock, rap, and dance music anti establishment? Why aren't more of them steered almost inevitably, as we were back in the day, toward progressive politics? What happened was that, broadly speaking, the more pop music became successful commercially, musicians no longer represented a movement, but just themselves and their music careers, their musical niche, and their lifestyles. Any community involved was the group of people following big stars such as Taylor Swift. Not to disrespect her, but during the last presidential campaign, people could only infer who she might vote for. Until late in the campaign, she endorsed Kamala Harris, a move that almost seemed calculated to cause as few waves as possible among her supporters. Again, I don't mean to pile on her. Thus, you have fans following top musicians with little or no conception that rock, blues, and jazz were once poised against the prevailing culture. It doesn't occur to them that voting for Trump is inconsistent with their enthusiasm for those genres. To sum up, again, with that conduit to political consciousness blocked, one's chances of becoming a progressive are greatly reduced, especially for the aforementioned low information voters. Once upon a time, you could be ignorant about politics and important issues. But if you had that sense of what's cool, what's not, that rock and roll inculcated in you, you could hear that a particular candidate was off key and sounding the wrong note. In the end, it doesn't take much to sniff out a fool.